Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
As the death toll from Saturday's massive bombing in Baghdad rises to 250 in the largest car bombing since the Iraq War began, a long-awaited British inquiry slams former Prime Minister Tony Blair for backing the 2003 U.S. invasion that destroyed Iraq and destabilized the region. We'll speak to Tariq Ali and Iraqi exile Sami Ramadani in London. Then to Bangladesh and Saudi Arabia, which both suffered ISIS attacks this week during the final days of the holy month of Ramadan. We'll speak to Islamic scholar Tariq Ramadan in Oxford and go to Bangladesh.
The militant groups are taking our innocent young people, and in the name of religion, they are misguiding them and sending them to the death trap. Islam is a religion of peace. Islam does not support killing innocent people.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is not recommending charges against Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton over her use of multiple private email servers while she was Secretary of State. This comes despite FBI Director James Comey saying Clinton was extremely careless in her handling of classified information.
Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information.
The FBI analyzed 30,000 emails, finding at least 110 that contained classified information at the time they were sent or received. FBI Director Comey said a handful of these were marked as classified at the time, a finding that contradicts Clinton's claims. The FBI found 8 email chains containing top-secret information. Comey also said it was, quote, possible that hostile actors gained access to Secretary Clinton's personal email account, unquote. Republican lawmakers and presumptive Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump criticized the FBI for not recommending charges against Hillary Clinton. House Speaker Paul Ryan tweeted, quote, the announcement defies explanation, unquote. Trump said the finding was evidence the system's rigged.
Ever that we've seen that our system is absolutely, totally rigged.
The FBI's announcement came only hours before President Obama campaigned for Hillary Clinton during a rally in Charlotte, North Carolina.
But I can tell you this. Hillary Clinton has been tested, and there has never been any man or woman more qualified for this office than Hillary Clinton.
At the North Carolina rally, President Obama and Hillary Clinton faced protests from teachers demanding the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency release local students who are currently detained and facing deportation. In a statement, the teachers said, quote, ICE is denying our students their right to an education and preventing many from graduating, unquote. North Carolina's been one of the states hardest hit by ICE raids this year. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton faced more criticism from teachers during a speech at the National Education Association's Assembly Tuesday when she provoked booing from unionized teachers by suggesting public schools and charter schools work together to improve education.
When schools get it right, whether they're traditional public schools or public charter schools, let's figure out what's working. No, let's figure out what's working and share it with schools across America. We can do that. We've got no time for all these education wars.
The National Education Association's the largest teachers' union. Its leadership endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2015, despite protests from some of its rank-and-file members who supported Bernie Sanders. A Jewish employee of a newspaper owned by Donald Trump's Orthodox Jewish son-in-law has called on him to speak out against anti-Semitism in Trump's campaign. Jared Kushner, who's married to Ivanka, Donald Trump's daughter, is an Orthodox Jew who owns the Observer newspaper. He's been a key member of Donald Trump's campaign. In the open letter, Observer entertainment writer Dana Schwartz wrote, quote, "When you stand silent and smiling in the background, his Jewish son-in-law, you're giving his most hateful supporters tacit approval," unquote. This comes after Trump tweeted an anti-Semitic image showing Hillary Clinton a pile of cash and a six-pointed Star of David, along with the words, "most corrupt candidate ever." The image originally appeared on a white supremacist message board. In response to the open letter, Jared Kushner wrote, Trump, quote, "does not at all subscribe to any racist or anti-Semitic thinking," unquote. In news from Iraq, the long-awaited British inquiry into the Iraq War has just been released. The Chilcot report is 2.6 million words long, about 3 times the length of the Bible. It blames former British Prime Minister Tony Blair for deliberately exaggerating the threat posed by Saddam Hussein in the lead-up to the Iraq War. This comes as the Iraqi Interior Minister, Mohammed Gaban, has announced his resignation following the suicide bombing in Baghdad that killed as many as 250 people. It was the deadliest bombing in Iraq since the 2003 U.S.-led invasion. We'll have more on this weekend's bombing in the Chilcot report after headlines. In Yemen, a suicide car bomber has killed 10 soldiers at a checkpoint near a military base in the southern city of Aden. Yemeni officials say militants went on to raid the military base, leading to hours of fighting. Meanwhile, at least 6 people have been killed by 2 U.S. drone strikes in southern Yemen over the weekend. Yemeni officials say the victims were suspected of being members of al-Qaeda. In South Africa, a judge has sentenced Olympic and Paralympic runner Oscar Pistorius to 6 years in prison for murdering his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, in 2013. He'd been facing a minimum 15-year prison term, but today the judge gave him less than half that sentence, citing mitigating factors such as Pistorius's remorse. This is the same judge who convicted Pistorius to a lesser charge of manslaughter 2 years ago, a charge that was later reversed by a higher court for being too lenient. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, protests have erupted over the fatal police shooting of 37-year-old African-American Alton Sterling. Cell phone video of the shooting appears to show a Baton Rouge police officer pinning Sterling to the ground outside a convenience store, then pointing a gun at his chest. The video then captures the sound of multiple gunshots. A warning to our television audience, the video is graphic.
They shot him? Oh my goodness.
They killed this boy.
Oh.
The East Baton Rouge coroner says Sterling died from multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and back. Hundreds have been protesting in Baton Rouge since the shooting. Meanwhile, in New York, Attorney General Eric Schneiderman has opened an investigation into the fatal off-duty police shooting of an unarmed Brooklyn man on the 4th of July. Delron Small was driving with his girlfriend and 3 children through East New York when he and off-duty police officer Wayne Isaacs had a confrontation while driving. The police say Small then got out of his car and punched Officer Isaac in the face. Although a witness says Small did not hit the officer, Officer Isaacs then shot Small multiple times, killing him. This comes as Baltimore prosecutors have been dealt a blow in the next trial of a police officer charged in the death of Freddie Gray, who died of spinal injuries sustained in police custody last year. On Tuesday, a judge ruled prosecutors cannot introduce evidence related to Officer Brian Rice's training during his trial, which begins Thursday. His training was key to the prosecutor's case. 2 police officers have already been acquitted on all charges for their role in Freddie Gray's death. An award-winning Iranian filmmaker, Abbas Kiarostami, has died. He was one of the most significant figures in a new wave of Iranian cinema that emerged following the 1979 revolution. In 1997, he won the top prize at Cannes for his film Taste of Cherry. This is Kiarostami speaking in 1997.
I think even if we have censorship in Iran, We should deal with it ourselves. As my father used to say, if your head breaks, it better break in your own hat. We shouldn't talk about it anywhere else because there's no advantage in it. Nobody can untie our knots or solve our problems. For that reason, I never speak about censorship outside of Iran, especially for foreign reporters. Often I ask them, don't you have your own censorship?
Abbas Kiarostami died on Monday of cancer at the age of 76. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzales. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In Iraq, the death toll from Saturday's car bombing in Baghdad has topped 250, making it the deadliest car bombing in that country since the 2003 U.S. invasion. The massive blast targeted shoppers preparing for the Eid, marking the end of Ramadan. A fire then spread to nearby buildings. On Sunday, a local resident decried the bombing.
Is this Eid? Every Eid we celebrate. Is this our Eid? Is this our Eid? Is this our Eid that everybody celebrates? Is this the Eid we should celebrate? People came to buy clothes to celebrate Eid. Now they are buying coffins. They're buying coffins. May God punish those who are responsible.
While Iraq is marking a third day of mourning, a long-awaited British inquiry into the Iraq War has just been released. The chair of the official inquiry, Sir John Chilcot, announced the key findings earlier today.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. The government failed to achieve its stated objectives.
The Chilcot report goes on to blame former Prime Minister Tony Blair of deliberately exaggerating the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. Part of the report includes private correspondence between Blair and President George W. Bush. 8 months before the invasion, Blair wrote to Bush, quote, "I will be with you, whatever." In June 2003, less than 3 months after the invasion began, Blair privately wrote to Bush that the task in Iraq is, quote, "absolutely awesome, and I'm not at all sure we're geared for it." Blair added, quote, "and if it falls apart and everything falls apart in the region, everything falls apart in the region." Earlier today, members of the Stop the War Coalition gathered in London to read off the names of Iraqis killed since the U.S.-UK invasion.
Feta Ghazi, aged 8. Nada Abdullah, 16. Lance Corporal James McCoo, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers. Fusilier Keelan Tullington, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers.
Ammar Mohammed Hamoudi, aged 1. And Noor El-Hudi Saad Hamoudi.
To talk more about the state of Iraq today and the newly released Chilcot inquiry, we're joined by two guests in London. Tariq Ali is a political commentator, historian, activist, filmmaker, author, editor of the New Left Review. His most recent book, The Extreme Center, A Warning. Sami Ramadani is an Iraqi-born lecturer in sociology. He was a political exile from Saddam's regime and serves on the steering committee of Stop the War Coalition. Tariq Ali and Sami Ramadani, welcome to Democracy Now! Sami Ramadani, let's begin with you. You're an Iraqi exile. You live in London. The Chilcot report has just come out. Prime Minister Cameron has addressed it on the floor of the Parliament. Sir Chilcot has given this report. Talk about his findings. This has been, what, 7 years in the making?
Basically, I think the Chilcot report, from what I have just read briefly about it, it seems it has confirmed what many of us thought, overwhelmingly Iraqis and Middle Easterners and people across the world felt long before the war started, actually, that this build-up to the war was being based on false evidence, on exaggerated evidence, on lies. And the Chilcot report, I think, confirms this. It brings into the open more evidence to prove that point. So to that extent, it has not brought something radically new, but it has confirmed, and that is important, it has confirmed what we all knew, that the Iraq war was based on a lie and that it was predetermined. And I think it was on your program that General Wesley Clark was interviewed, I think by yourself, Amy,
yes,
that the Pentagon decided within days of 9/11 to have regime change interventions and wars in 7 countries in addition to Afghanistan. And he named Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. So you're looking at a scenario where since the mid-1990s, the so-called neocons plotted a strategy following the collapse of the Soviet Union to go on the offensive and topple regimes and expand and secure important oil resources and raw materials, cut down any rival competitions. But in the meantime, Iraq as a society, as a state, was destroyed in the cruelest of fashions, shock and awe, mass crimes on an untold scale since World War II, and the Vietnam War, of course. So you have a situation where a society, though we had a dictator ruling, it wasn't removing the dictator that was the real objective, but really controlling Iraq. And failing to control it, they eventually destroyed it, just like they did in Libya, they are doing in Syria, and so on. And so it fits in within that scale, but the biggest tragedy of all is the loss of life. Over 1 million people lost their lives in Iraq, the infrastructure destroyed, the health services destroyed, educational system, employment, at every turn, electricity, clean water. Iraq was a fairly advanced country by third world standards. All this was destroyed. The ordinary lives of the people were ruined. Sectarianism was encouraged. Divide and rule was encouraged. Terrorism was brought into the country. The terrorism we see today was, in fact, consciously encouraged to encourage divide and rule, so that the U.S.-led occupation and Britain, of course, could dominate the country and shape its future. But the whole thing is quite tragic, and I find it difficult sometimes even to emotionally control myself talking about the tragedies that befell the Iraqi people.
Well, I'd like to ask Tariq Ali your response to the report, especially the sections that talk about Blair's almost obsession with regime change, with getting rid of Saddam Hussein, and also why did it take 7 years to produce this report?
It took 7 years because it took 7 years because every single person interviewed had to have a chance to see the report, and Blair and his lawyers were looking at the fine print very closely, as were the generals and other people. The findings of the report, quite honestly, are not very remarkable or original. As Sami has already said, these were things that were being said by all of us before this war started. It was what virtually every speaker said at the million-strong Stop the War demonstration in London. Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn in particular have been saying all this. So to have official confirmation that what we were all saying was right is nice, but it's too little and too late. And because the report had no desire or was not permitted to discuss the legality of this exercise, it means that while there is evidence in the report for independent lawyers to proceed and file a citizen suit, the report itself doesn't allow the state to actually prosecute Blair for war crimes. He is a war criminal. He pushed the country into this illegal war. His supporters in Parliament are trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, who was 100% right on this war, backed by the bulk of the media. So we're in a strange situation now. The report, I think, will anger lots of people who, unlike us, were not convinced by the movement that what was taking place was a lie, based on a lie, and it was illegal. What is going to happen now remains to be seen, but I would very much hope that independent groups of lawyers and jurists demand now that Blair is charged and tried. It's very clear he pushed the war. He forced the intelligence services to prepare dodgy dossiers. He pushed his Attorney General to changing his opinions before he was allowed to address the cabinet. All that we have in the report. The question is anyone going to answer for it, or is this just designed to be therapeutic?
And Tariq, about this whole issue of the Labour leadership in Parliament trying to remove Jeremy Corbyn, even though he was one of the most vocal anti-war advocates, and even though the base, the majority base of the Labour Party still supports him.
Well, I mean, it's bizarre. Some people said to me that the reason they tried this coup against Jeremy in Parliament was so he wasn't leader of the Labour Party when the Chilcot report came out. We'll see what he says today at his press conference in 3 or 4 hours' time. But I think he will be very harsh. The irony is that the woman who is the main candidate against him is a supporter of the Iraq War. Now that we have a judicial inquiry which says what it says about the war, I think surely it's time that constituency Labour parties started the process of removing some of the chief warmongers from Parliament. They don't represent anyone now except a cabinet in the past, a government which went to war. And if you look at some of the footage being shown on Channel 4, today, what Corbyn said, what Ben said, with what Blair said, mean the utter complacency and brutality with which Blair told Parliament, there are some people here who think that regime change is wrong, and Gordon Brown nodding vigorously and Margaret Beckett on the other side. These are all the people involved in trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, and something, I hope Labour members will now fight back, because it's precisely against this sort of thing that Corbyn has been fighting the right inside the Labour Party.
Sami Ramadani, you were on the steering committee of Stop the War Coalition, a friend of Labour opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn. This backlash against him around the Brexit vote, which he was opposed to when he was the opposition leader and spoke out against, on Democracy Now!, spoke out against Britain leaving the European Union just 2 weeks ago. What you think is behind it?
Really, my own feeling is, probably Tariq would share that view with me, is that they are genuinely worried that Jeremy Corbyn might lead the Labour movement to victory in the next general election. And they are terrified of that prospect. They looked at the 4 by-elections that happened since he was elected, and they were all won with comfortable majorities. In fact, the last one doubled Labour's majority. And then they looked at the local election results, and again, he did very well. And they are genuinely worried that if he wins, what's going to happen to them? What's
They're
going
concerned
to happen
he'll
to
be
their
Prime Minister?
record of supporting the Iraq War, of voting with the Tories, or abstaining on important welfare policies? policies, the Tories applying neocon policies. They seem to prevaricate or concede to Tory demands and so on and so forth. And their abandonment of working class communities over 2025. They continued on a Thatcherite policy. Margaret Thatcher's premiership destroyed so many working class communities, and the new Labour leadership under Tony Blair simply continued that policy of abandoning working class communities, and some of whom became so disillusioned even voted with UKIP, which is an extreme right-wing party.
Sami Ramadani, we have to break.
And Jeremy Corbyn is providing a new vision and a new strategy, and they want to undermine him.
Sami Ramadani, we have to break, and Tariq Ali, but we're going to come back to ask you about what happened in Iraq this weekend, the largest car bomb attack since the Gulf War began. We'll be back in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzales.
In Iraq, the death toll from Saturday's car bombing in Baghdad has topped 250, making it the deadliest car bombing in that country since the 2003 U.S. invasion. While Iraq is marking a third day of mourning, a long-awaited British inquiry into the Iraq War has just been released, blaming Tony Blair for his role in choosing to invade Iraq. I wanted to turn to former Prime Minister Blair. In November, he told CNN's Fareed Zakaria that there were, quote, elements of truth to the claim that removing Saddam Hussein played a part in the creation of ISIS.
When people look at the rise of ISIS, many people point to the invasion of Iraq as the principal cause. What do you say to that?
I think there are elements of truth in that, but I think we've, again, got to be extremely careful, otherwise we'll misunderstand what's going on in Iraq and in Syria today. Of course, you can't say that those of us who removed Saddam in 2003 bear no responsibility for the situation in 2015.
Sami Ramadani, your response to that clip and to the recent bombing in Baghdad and the general situation in Iraq now, 13 years after the war started?
I think I just have to contain my anger, really, because listening to Tony Blair there pontificating about his role in this genocidal war makes any human being really with a bit of humanity in them quite angry. After all this death and destruction, he would be sitting there trying to justify the fact that terrorism was brought into Iraq after 2003. All of these so-called leaders of ISIS, by the way, ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was its official name. And we know Al-Qaeda was founded in Afghanistan with the help of the CIA and the support of Britain and so on. But as usual, some of these terrorist organizations that they encourage and arm bite the hand that feeds them occasionally. But that doesn't change the strategic picture that nearly all Iraqis, even supporters, some of the supporters of the invasion and occupation, testify to the fact that terrorism was encouraged by the occupation forces, whether of the British or American variety. And the multiplicity of these terrorist organizations was also encouraged by the regional powers. Saudis, Qataris, Turkey, they're all close U.S. allies. They funded these organizations. They supplied them with arms. Turkey gradually became the logistical base of these terrorist organizations. Some 30,000 fighters, according to the United Nations, came from over 80 countries across the world. Trained fighters, most of them, from as far as Chechnya and Libya and Tunisia and Saudi Arabia, of course, and so on. And they were all, as the New York Times, as Seymour Hersh, as many other reliable sources have revealed, that the CIA coordinated a lot of this from Turkey. So to sit down and listen to Tony Blair trying to dissociate himself and George Bush and the policymakers then of the proliferation of terrorist groups, the murders in Iraq, really, Iraqis, if you ask ordinary people, they will tell you we are still at war. The 2003 invasion and occupation of the country has not ended. This terrorism is a continuation of that war. They see these terrorist organizations as an arm of the same invasion and occupation of the country. They're still dividing and ruling. They're still trying to dominate Iraq because the Iraqi people have a great history of fighting for independence, for progress, for socialism,
Sami Ramadani,
even, and they cannot control the country that easily, and terrorism is serving them.
Sami and Tariq Ali, I want to play for you a clip of Donald Trump yesterday in Raleigh, North Carolina, talking about Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? He was a bad guy, really bad guy. But you know what he did well? He killed terrorists. He did that so good. They didn't read him the rights. They didn't talk. They were a terrorist. It was over. Today, Iraq is Harvard for terrorism. You want to be a terrorist, you go to Iraq. It's like Harvard.
That was Donald Trump yesterday. Tariq Ali, your response.
Well, I mean, you know, how can one deny the truth of what he's saying? I mean, yesterday, the BBC here showed a photograph, a filmed interview with a guy who'd helped to bring Saddam Hussein's statue down, which was a staged event, Amy, as you know, immediately after Baghdad was occupied. That guy appeared on the BBC yesterday and said he's ashamed he did that. He wants to apologize for it. He said, Saddam killed members of my family, but life, everyday life in Iraq, under him was much better than it is today. Most Iraqis, even if they hated Saddam and suffered, say life was much better under him than it was under the occupation and what's going on today. So Trump is not wrong, and precisely because he is capable of saying things like that and Clinton isn't, because her consort as president was involved in the sanctions against Iraq. Madeleine Albright defended the deaths of 500,000 kids because of the sanctions. So what can one say? And the other thing which is worth remembering, they're now all saying they made mistakes in Iraq. They've made the same and even worse mistakes in Libya. They're carrying on with Syria. They're doing nothing to stop the Saudi invasion of Yemen or the Saudi occupation of Bahrain, and then they pretend to be a bit more humble. We won't make the same mistakes again. Well, you are making them even as the West is watching.
We want to bring another guest into this conversation. Sami Ramadani, Iraqi-born lecturer, speaking to us from London, as well as the well-known British-Pakistani author, commentator, editor of New Left Review, Tariq Ali. But we're going to turn right now to Oxford in Britain. Tariq Ramadan is professor of contemporary Islamic studies at Oxford University, author of a number of influential books on Islam and the West, including Western Muslims and the Future of Islam, and In the Footsteps of the Prophet, Lessons from the Life of Muhammad. Ramadan was named by Time magazine as one of the most important innovators of the 21st century. Under the Bush administration, he was not allowed to come into the United States, where he was invited to teach at Notre Dame University. Tariq Ramadan now teaches at Oxford. Professor Ramadan, your response to the Chilcot report, the attacks in Iraq, and then we'll move to Saudi Arabia and the ISIS attacks this weekend there.
Look, I think that what we heard from Tariq Ali and Sami Ramadani, these are important points. That it's very true that what happened there and what is happening now is connected to policies that were decided in Washington and decided in London, which had nothing to do with human rights, had nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It was all about interest and geostrategic interest. And if we go for it, we understand that the war was launched for very, very, in fact, geostrategic and economic interest and had nothing to do with the dignity. So now we know that, and things are happening now that are showing how much or how many contradictions we had in the British policies following in the footsteps of the American policy in the region. And then the connection that we have here with Saudi Arabia as an ally in the region, and the mess that we have now in the new Middle East is all has to do with some of the reasons that they were talking about right now, and we cannot disconnect this from that. If we do this, we are completely misled, and we can end up with what is happening in Saudi Arabia with the attacks during the last days by supporting the regime and not understanding that it's much more complex than that.
Well, Tariq Ramadan, what about those attacks? Because here you're seeing a situation of actually, especially in the attack in Medina, near the a holy site of Saudi Arabia and of Islam, the attacks on Muslims themselves.
Yes, but this is not new. You are talking about Iraq, and this is every day we have exactly the same people targeting Muslims. Shia or Sunni armed Muslims is the same in Syria. It's the same in the whole region. It's even the same with Saudi Arabia attacking Yemen. So we have, you know, the majority of the victims are Muslims. And here what we have in Saudi Arabia, which is new, is targeting Al-Medina, which is the second sacred place for Muslims. So it's as if they are now ready to go against all the Muslims, and you can hear from around the world people saying this has nothing to do with Islam, it's against any Islamic teachings. At the same time, if you look at the symbols, they were targeting Shia mosques, they were targeting the US embassy, so they are targeting symbols. So we have to ask ourselves what they are trying to do here. Is it because they are losing ground in Iraq that they are doing this? Is it in fact just to show that they can target the people wherever they are? But the point for us here is that there is no clear vision in what they are doing except to spread around violence and violent extremism. So we have to condemn this, but we have to take a step back and to try to understand what is happening in the region and who are the people who are playing. And you know, Tariq Ali was saying they are making mistakes. Unfortunately, I'm more cynical than that. I'm not sure that they are mistakes. I think that they are policies that are helping the United States and European countries in the mess to sell weapons and still to control the region out of this completely destabilized situation.
The King of Saudi Arabia has promised to strike with an iron hand against those responsible for a suicide attack near the Prophet's Mosque in Medina on Monday. Militants carried out 3 separate suicide bomb attacks across Saudi Arabia on the same day, including an attack in the holy city of Medina that killed 4 security officers near the mosque where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to be buried. The mosque is one of the holiest sites for Muslims worldwide. An earlier attack was carried out near the U.S. consulate in the Saudi city of Jeddah. 2 security officers were wounded. Another bombing took place near dusk outside a Shia mosque in the mainly Shia eastern city of Qatif. No group has claimed responsibility for Monday's attacks, but the so-called Islamic State has carried out similar bombings targeting Shia Muslims and Saudi security forces. The Sunni Muslim militant group has called for the overthrow of the Saudi monarchy.
And now the Saudi Interior Ministry spokesman has identified the assailant in the Jeddah attack as a 35-year-old Pakistani expatriate called Abdullah Khalzar Khan. According to the ministry, Khan worked as a private driver in the city for 12 years. The attacks were carried out as people were preparing for the Eid al-Fitr celebrations to mark the end of the holy month of Ramadan. Tariq Ramadan, as you talk about what happened in Saudi Arabia. Can you talk specifically to an audience who is not so familiar with the religious significance of all of these places about not only the attacks, but the Saudi government's response?
Look, first, from an Islamic perspective, it's something which is completely against the Islamic principles, and especially to target the holy city of Medina, the messenger city. It's known as Al-Madina al-Munawwara, which is the illuminated and illuminating city for the Muslims. So first, this is against the basic principles. The second thing, which is also very important from what is happening, is that now we have the Saudi regime saying we are going to be very tough on these. The problem that we have, which is internal to the Islamic reference and the Islamic trends, is that the type of Islamic interpretations that we have in Saudi Arabia, called Wahhabism or Salafi, as they call themselves, is very literalist. So, in fact, they are creating a mindset which is very dogmatic. It's us versus them, that is instrumentalized by more violent extremist groups going as far as being violent. So there is a gray area between the two interpretations or ideologies. Now what we are going to see is the Saudi regime being very tough with, you know, in the name of suspicions towards anyone who is going to speak out. But we also have to say that this is not new. This regime is very tough with any type of opposition. Remember, during the time of the Arab uprisings, we had a mufti saying to the Muslims, it's against Islam to take into the street against the regime, while you know, what we also have to say as Muslims, and this is why it's a shared responsibility. All what was said by Tariq Ali and Sami Ramadani about the Western policies and the visions and the contradictions with our own values in the West, this is right. But at the same time, it's very important for Muslims and for the Muslim voices to be vocal about the contradictions that we have with the Saudi regime. It's not because I'm condemning what is happening and the terrorist attacks now and the violent extremists that we have to condemn and we have to be vocal, that we should end up supporting a regime where there is no freedom of expression. There is a very narrow type of interpreting the scriptural sources. There is a very tough regime, no freedom, no women's rights. And I think that on this, we should not be on the side of the victims and taking the Saudi regime as the victim of what is happening. They are, in fact, instrumental in all what is happening in the region. And there is one thing that we cannot deny, that it's part of the message sent by the violent extremists, is that Saudi Arabia is in fact connected to great powers and playing a role in security, in monitoring, in the lack of freedom, in torturing the people, which is a very dirty role, and we have to say it, and we have to be clear on this as Muslims, as people who are now promoting and who want democracy for the Muslim majority countries and a more consistent policy in the region.
And Tariq Ali, what about this particular and complex role of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East and in the various conflicts in the region?
Well, Tariq Ramadan is perfectly right on this. I agree with him. This is nothing new, by the way. It started during the Cold War, when the United States used the Saudis to help get Wahhabi scholars extremely rigid in their philosophical view of Islam, like the equivalent of some born-again Christian sects in the United States. And they were sent all over. They were sent to Indonesia. They were sent to Pakistan. Of course, they existed in the Arab world to a certain extent. And the aim was to fight communism. And they did it, and they helped, and they have grown stronger and stronger. And the main jihadi organizations, so-called, are very influenced by Wahhabism and believe in it, and they are ultra-sectarian, not just to other Sunnis, which we know, as they kill them endlessly, but they regard the Shia as heretics, not part of Islam, which is why they attack Shia mosques, why they kill Shia people, why they target Shia clerics, etc., etc. So this disunity is linked very strongly, I think, to the role which the West has played in the region and which they recently, only most recently in Iraq, armed some of the Shia clerics to attack the Sunnis. They engaged in ethnic cleansings in the middle of Baghdad. They've created absolute havoc. The Sunni-Shia divide, which existed but on a very mild level. There were intermarriages even. The political parties had mixed central committees of Shias, Sunnis, Christians, others. That has also been wrecked by the American occupation of Iraq. And it's what we are witnessing is the Balkanization of the Middle East, which is why these monstrous groups spring up. They spring up, these monster groups, and no one can do anything about them because they've partially created them.
Tariq Ramadan, what do you think the response should be?
I think first that what we heard from Tariq Ali, it's very important, and once again, nothing new. In fact, if you look at the American policy in Latin America, it's selling weapons on both sides and letting people go for fighting, making money out of it and getting the advantage through the security. So I think that here, what is important for us first is to disconnect in a way this violent extremism from, the qualification of being Islamic. And this is why I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with Islam. I disagree with the people who are saying, no, it has nothing to do with Islam. We are dealing with people who come, who are quoting the Quran. We now, around the world, the Muslims should be clearer, not only on the violent extremists, but you can't just be against the violent extremists on the religious side and not understand that it has to do with a political stance that we need to have. And the political stance is first against all the dictatorships in the region, to be clear on all the Gulf states that they are now playing a role supporting the American policies or the European policies, and sometimes torn apart. They are torn apart between Chinese and Russian interests and the West. This is where we need something. We were all celebrating the Arab Spring. I was very cautious with this. I said, be careful, because there are not political reasons behind. There are much more economic reasons and geostrategic realities there. So I think that on this, we need to be clear on what we want for the Muslim majority countries or for the Middle East, because now it's true. It's the Balkanization of the region. This is where we need to be quite clear. On our side, it's important in the United States, in the West, to have voices coming together. And once again, it's not a Muslim business. It's our business as citizens to come together and to be critical towards our own governments, because we cannot just sit down and cry when people are killed, not understanding that the policies behind and all what we have seen, which is not new, it's still now counting the dead people while others are making money out of it, because the destabilized Middle East, in the name of security, it helps the people to sell weapons. It's not new. To get their interest in oil or in uranium or in lithium, as it were, in Afghanistan. So this is where we citizens, we have to wake up. We have to wake up. And if you see what is happening in my country here in the UK, with all the discussion that you had about Corbyn and the people who are playing, it's called connected, because these are people who did what they did during the war, supporting the war, and now they are coming to talk about, democratization and human dignity. That's not acceptable for us. So this is what we need to do on both sides, so to speak.
Before we wrap, I just wanted to ask you one final question with the release of the Chilcot report. In 2004, Professor Ramadan, you'd accepted a job at University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Time magazine listed you among the top 100 thinkers in the world. But 9 days before Ramadan was set to start teaching here in the United States, before you were set to start teaching, the Bush administration revoked your visa, invoking a provision of the Patriot Act that allows the government to deny entry to non-citizens who, quote, endorse or espouse terrorism. So you weren't allowed in during the Bush years. During the Obama years, they let you in. In light of the Chilcot report, what do you say about what happened to you then?
You know, what I said to the Homeland Security when they came all the way to see me in Switzerland, and all their questions were about two things. When I was saying the Iraqi resistance is right because your presence in Iraq is wrong, and I was adding to this because in all our discussion, it's as if we are forgetting the Palestinian resistance. I said the Palestinian resistance is right. We may disagree on the means, but we have to come to an understanding that there will be no peace in the region if you don't change your policy. Years after this, even though I can enter into the country, the problem is that we were hopeful with Obama. The policies have not changed. It's exactly the same. And while we were celebrating Clinton before Bush, Clinton was in fact the one who was in charge with the sanction, which, as it was said, killed 500,000 people. At that point, what I said at that time, which prevented me, and I was banned from the country, to say in a clear way that the American policy is one of the main reasons why we have all these people being killed and the spread of terrorism all in the region and in Afghanistan to African countries now. We have to take responsibility. So I was banned from entering. Now I can enter. It doesn't mean that things are changing. It's the same dirty politics with very nice words that we had with President Obama, unfortunately. And if you look at what is coming now with Trump and Hillary Clinton, not good news for the States.
Tariq Ramadan, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University, author of a number of influential books on Islam in the West, including Western Muslims and the Future of Islam, as well as In the Footsteps of the Prophet, Lessons from the Life of Muhammad. Ramadan was named by Time magazine as one of the most important innovators of the 21st century. And thanks to Tariq Ali, political commentator, historian, editor of New Left Review, and Sami Ramadani. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the attacks in Bangladesh. Stay with us.
Amy, I'll leave him.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzales.
We end the show today in Bangladesh, which is mourning a deadly attack that killed 20 people. On Friday, militants seized control of the trendy Holy Artisan Bakery in the diplomatic district of the capital, wielding explosives, guns, and swords. In the ensuing 11-hour siege, the militants killed 20 diners from around the world, including 9 Italians, 7 Japanese, 1 Indian, 2 Bangladeshis, and 1 U.S. citizen. 2 police officers were later killed when the authorities raided the restaurant and killed 5 of the 6 attackers. Authorities say the attackers were young men from Bangladesh's elite, many of whom attended the country's top schools.
For more, we're joined by Sarah Hussain, a barrister practicing in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh in the areas of constitutional public interest and family law. Sarah Hussain, welcome to Democracy Now! She's joining us from London. Can you talk about what happened in Bangladesh and Dhaka?
Yes, well, in this last incident, what seems to have happened is that this group of young men went into the restaurant, into the Holy Cafe, surrounded the place, divided people up based on their identity as foreigners, as non-Bangladeshis, and critically as non-Muslims. Those they identified as non-Muslims, which they apparently did by getting people to recite surahs, verses from the Quran, they executed immediately, hacking them to death. They also they let some people out eventually, but most people were killed inside the cafe. It was surrounded by police and paramilitaries, but somewhat belatedly. And in the operation that resulted, as you just said, more than 20 people were killed. And it seems now that one of those killed, in fact, was not one of those who was identified earlier as one of the attackers, seems to have been a person who was working inside the cafe and was actually killed in the fire from the law enforcing agencies. It also seems that one of the people who was working inside the cafe had been arrested and has been apparently, according to reports from Bangladesh, very badly tortured and brutalized at the hands of the law enforcing agencies as well. And still, it's not clear, although this has been claimed, it seems, by supposedly ISIS. According to the Bangladesh government, it's still not being conceded or admitted that it may be by an international extremist group of this kind. So far, they've still been saying it may be, at least one source has been saying it's homegrown terror repeatedly, without any acknowledgement of any kind of transnational links.
And Sarah Hossain, what about this issue of some of the attackers being identified as coming from educated, middle-class or upper-class families, something we've seen in other attacks in other parts of the world by radical militants?
Yes, well, this is something I think that really has shocked people, that some of those who've been identified and who were initially identified on social media as being from some of the top private English medium schools and private English medium universities. Certainly some of these universities, this one in particular, has been identified before as something of a breeding ground for extremism. Hizb ut-Tahrir was known to be active there, and other organizations. In the last few days, several reports are coming out from other students there who are saying that these kinds of groups are active there, trying to create a support base for fundamentalist or extremist organizations, Islamist organizations.
Can you talk about Bangladesh? And when people talk about the war on terror, when people talk about what's going on in different countries, we hear Iraq, we hear Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria. Bangladesh is not usually included. What is happening here, Sarah Hossain?
Yeah, I think it's very disturbing that Bangladesh is being targeted in this way. And since we're not in that sense in the sort of scene of war, we're not in the center of the Middle East. I found listening to your previous interviews, I don't think it's so easy just to link us to the story of what's happening in the Middle East. Bangladesh has got a very particular history. As you know, it became independent 45 years ago, precisely because it rejected the notion of religion being a sufficient binding force to build a nation. And it very consciously, I think, this country, Bangladesh, has developed a secular identity and still has, I think we still have, and we're safeguarding the tattered remains of our secular identity and our secular values. Bangladesh also, I think, has had a very distinct place in the world because we've really achieved kind of quite remarkable changes in terms of development. If you look at our profile, certainly as Tariq Ramadan would have it, a Muslim majority country, but I think for many of us, we would not see that as our defining characteristic. We would see ourselves as a developing country where incredible social change has happened in a very short period of time, where women have really fought for and won a space. And they haven't done it thanks to working with moderate Muslim groups. They've done it because they've been part of civil society groups often. They've been part of benefiting from government policies that have been pro-poor, pro-women, and pro-secularism for a large part of our history. We've battled against other forces. We've battled against the military, authoritarianism, which we still have in a secular guise, of course, and we've battled against fundamentalists taking hold of our political processes. So I think the fact that we have these very distinct characteristics is a reason why we're coming under attack. And I think because there's been a very different culture, which is not, I would not see that in the same trajectory as Muslim majority culture as such. I think we've had many very particular differences that are the ones that are really coming under assault and threat.
Sarah Hossain,
prior to this incident,
the UN
series we've seen over the last 2 years of individual targeted attacks on activists, be they secular activists, be they activists seeking justice for war crimes, historic crimes from 45 years ago, be they gay activists trying to really change dramatically and importantly change the kind of notion, increase inclusion, I think, in our societies, increase recognition of diversity in our society. Those are the people who are come under attack. And what we've unfortunately seen is
we're going to have to leave it there, Sarah Hussain. I want to thank you for being with us, barrister practicing in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh in the areas of constitutional public interest and family law, speaking to us from London. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzales. Our website's democracynow.org. Thanks for joining us.